For those who are unfamiliar with the Bible, when they look at the Old Testament, which is probably not the best place to start, it looks like the God described there is this harsh, monster-like God who just wants to wipe out people. But when you come into the New Testament, it's the God who so loved the world, who sent his only Son. Why is there such a difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament? And this is what the message to the Hebrews addresses. The letter to the Hebrews, which I'm now referring to as the message to the Hebrews because it is a sermon, is something that is going to help those who are unfamiliar with the Old Testament to begin to put together all of the elements of the Old Testament and have them point to Jesus. And that's what I'm going to show you now as we look at how the Old Testament is bridged into the New Testament by the message to the Hebrews. For those who are unfamiliar with the Old Testament, I am going to argue that the way some people think the God of the New Testament is presented in the Old Testament is actually not accurate. That it is the same God. And in fact, if you have a closer look at the Old Testament, you'll see he's described as a God of compassion and love and mercy and faithfulness. And this is what I want you to see as we look at this message to the Hebrews. In the Old Testament, there's four things that really are pivotal. One is it's comprised of narratives, that is stories. That makes it a unique religious book, by the way. Secondly, it's comprised of rituals that are very mysterious to us now in our day and age. Thirdly, it's comprised of ceremonies, certain things that had to be practiced on a certain routine and rhythm. And then fourthly, it's comprised of laws, and some of those laws seem quite unusual, and there's different categories of laws which we'll touch on in a moment. Amazingly, the Gospel of Luke has Jesus describing to two travelers on the road to Emmaus. This was just after his resurrection, which these two travelers were beginning to hear word about. These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. You see, in that statement, Jesus is saying everything in, here the categories, the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. There's three categories. So there's three categories of the Old Testament that Jesus said it all points to him. Interesting. Psalms are poetry and songs and worship, and you would think, how could those things point to Christ? And they do, and we'll show you that in a moment. We'll take an example here. This is taken from Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 6, and what I'm going to show you is that the message to the Hebrews draws on each of those aspects, the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. So here we go. It has been testified somewhere, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Now this is to point out that passage is almost a direct quote from Psalm 8 verses 4 to 5. We'll start there. It says this: what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings. We saw Hebrews said angels, and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the work of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. Here we have the message to the Hebrews quoting the Psalms, the very thing that Jesus said points to him. And what we'll see as we go through the message to the Hebrews, that indeed it does point to Jesus. So the Old Testament is not a completely different message. It's not one that is disconnected from the New Testament. In fact, it is the platform for the New Testament to make any sense at all. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 17 says this: therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. So I want you to see this as pointing to Jesus. This is the message to the Hebrews, where it says these very, very Old Testament motifs. It's a faithful high priest, and we're going to see the first 5 books in particular really points to these motifs in the message to the Hebrews. He would be a faithful high priest. And what would the faithful high priest do? He would do service of God. And what were the priests doing? And if you've read the Old Testament, you see they were often sacrificing animals, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But here we have this pointing to Jesus, and we're looking at this word that I guarantee you have not used today. It's the word make propitiation, which means to do something that circumvents or satisfies the wrath of the judge, the wrath of God in this instance, who is the judge. That's propitiation. That's what these sacrifices were to represent or symbolize or be a shadow to, as we'll have a look at. And so much of the Old Testament is actually grounded in these sacrifices, which involved animals, sacrificing animals by the various priests. In fact, the priests were the only ones authorized to do that. So I want to have a look at the priestly role here in the Old Testament, and we'll show how Hebrews says, well, ultimately, these priests were just a shadow of what Christ would ultimately do. And so this is taken from a scholar by the name of Richard Nelson in his book, Raising Up a Faithful Priest, Community and Priesthood in Biblical Theology. Now, I can't imagine that you've probably got that on your shelf, but I want to draw some of the principles that Professor Nelson has got in this book. So this is priestly rituals and sacrifice. Firstly, the priestly rituals were designed to, he says, prevent a breakdown in the orderly pattern of things, or to restore patterns that have now become disordered. So the second thing he points out is that in the Old Testament, priests, the rituals that they were practicing had to be classified. They could be classified under certain statuses. And he mentions 3 statuses. Firstly, the sacrifice of animals and the things that pertain to that, like taking their blood and splattering it on different things. That firstly was about maintenance. It was, and we see this in Leviticus chapter 23, where there's 7 festivals or feasts. A feast is not necessarily a food party. It's a ritual that involved a festivity of some sort. It also occurs in Numbers chapters 28 and 29, where there's certain things that just got to be maintained. Secondly, the rituals that the priests were involved with would also have the effect of reversing certain things. So, for example, in Leviticus chapter 14, and that deals with leprosy, how a leper could be pronounced clean. And then also we have on the Day of Atonement, that's Yom Kippur, mentioned in Leviticus 16. Now notice these references, Leviticus. The Levites were a part of the priestly order. There were Levites who were a part of a particular clan, and we'll look at those in a moment, but they were the ones responsible for doing much of these rituals. And then the third thing that these rituals did was they elevated, they upgraded a status of someone, and in particular, for the ones from the clan of Aaron within the Levites, they could become priests, so they could be installed as priests. So there was all sorts of rituals involved with that. So the Old Testament themes in the message to the Hebrews includes the characters of the Old Testament. They are mentioned, and the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that they are mentioned. But there are others. There are other characters who are mentioned as well. Moses, for example, was extremely important in Judaism and remains so. And the message to the Hebrews talks about the role that Moses played and how ultimately Moses actually points to Jesus. And we'll see that in Hebrews chapter 3. Secondly, this mysterious character by the name of Melchizedek, and he's referred to in chapter 7, at very least. He's also occurs elsewhere. But Melchizedek is a type of priest, and he in a very particular way is representing Christ, and we'll see that in a moment. And then thirdly, there's people that you may not have thought would be there, but if you've read the opening chapters of the Bible, they certainly appear very early. Abel, son of Adam and Eve, Enoch, and Noah, and then the patriarchs and others, and they're all mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. So significant characters. There's also significant structures mentioned. In fact, one is particularly mentioned, and the other one is kind of alluded to but not named, and we'll look at why that is. So firstly, there's the tabernacle. The tabernacle, you'll read about this as you go through Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and then you'll see it occurs in the early chapters of 1 Samuel, or 1 and 2 Samuel, and so the tabernacle was a place where these rituals and ceremonies were to take place, and it's incredibly significant because it actually, again, it points to Christ. There's a lot of symbolism in it. The next structure that I'm saying is mentioned is that it's not mentioned, and that's really, really odd. And if we had time, I would talk more about this. But the temple, just to say this, God ordered the tabernacle to be built. He never asked for a temple to be built. When Jesus came and the disciples, in the background to the New Testament, there was a temple in Jerusalem that was not ordered by God to be built. In fact, if we read through the book of Malachi, and I've done a whole series on Malachi, I invite you to have a look at that. The prophet Malachi said God would enter into that temple and he would bring judgment. And we would again say this points to Christ. So Malachi, a prophet, he's pointing to Christ. So the temple's not mentioned in there, and that's particularly odd because of the relevance of what that would have been like to the first century Jew in around AD 60s, just before the temple itself was destroyed. The other thing that's mentioned in the message to the Hebrews is the significance of the priesthood. So we've mentioned the Levites and the clan of Aaron within that tribe. But this guy Melchizedek is interesting. So in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 6 to 10, it specifically says that Christ is in the order of Melchizedek. And it mentions that Melchizedek is not having, there's no record of him having parents. There's no record of him dying. It's a mysterious thing. And there's also Abraham in the Old Testament pays him a tithe. And so it's interesting. So the Old Testament is pointing to this character Melchizedek as someone who actually is pointing us to Christ, the writer to the Hebrews says. And secondly, the other priesthood I've already mentioned, again, I'll say it, is Aaron. They're usually called the Aaronic priests. In other words, they are descended from this guy Aaron, who was the brother of Moses. And that's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 11, and in chapter 8. And so it's there. All right, the significance of the sacrifices. The sacrifices are the thing that often is quite hard for us to grasp in a very clinically clean sort of world that we live in now, where we don't have to kill our own food or hunt or gather or anything like that. But here in the Old Testament, they are sacrificing animals. And one of the things that Professor Nelson says is it'd be very easy to think this is all about killing. It's not about, and he says it's actually not about killing. It's about what the sacrifices were doing. And we mentioned maintenance of order, to reverse disorder, and to elevate certain people. And so these sacrifices are not so much about death, but they're actually the substitution of life. And this is, again, something we don't really have much of a way to correspond to. So, but what the message to the Hebrews says is all of these animal sacrifices were a type of Christ. They were foreshadowing what Christ would do. It would ultimately be the blood that Christ shed, and the blood represents someone's life, that would be for our salvation and peace with God. And so this is an important point that the message to the Hebrews is making. And then secondly, there are different types of sacrifices. You read through sometimes it's a goat, sometimes it's a lamb, sometimes it's a bull, sometimes it's even a bird. And all of these things, we haven't got time to look at it now, but they all represent a different aspect of Christ. So the feasts, the festivals, the Yom Kippur I mentioned in Leviticus 16, 2 goats come in, short straw is drawn for the one that will be sacrificed, and the other one is free to go. This one becomes the scapegoat, this one becomes the scapegoat. And there we have a picture of us standing before God on the day of judgment. And if you have surrendered your life to Christ and accepted his substitution for the payment of your sin and guilt, that he will be the one that's sacrificed and will be the one that goes free. And it's a beautiful picture. And that kind of thing happens with all of the sacrifices. They all point to Christ in some way. So what do we see in the message to the Hebrews? Ultimately, we see this, that Jesus was the one prophesied. So the prophet spoke of him. He was the one that the psalmists wrote about. So that's Psalms, and Jesus said all of the Psalms point to him in some way. And the law of Moses, Jesus fulfilled all of the law. He's the fulfilment of that law. They all point to him. So what does that mean for us? Well, it should mean this, that the God of the Old Testament is the same God of love and grace and mercy as revealed in the New Testament. Another way to put this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, Jesus the Christ, into the world, that whosoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did that. And so the Old Testament points to Jesus. I encourage you now, have a read through the message to the Hebrews. Hear how the writer is saying these various things that I've pointed out. And you'll begin to have a deeper appreciation for the Old Testament. It contains stories that are a shadow of our salvation. The sacrifices and the rituals and the ceremonies, they all point to Christ in some way, about how God would send someone who would be our sacrifice, our substitute, who would take our guilt and shame upon himself and pay the price for it, to offer up his life for us. And if that was all it was, wonderful. But it also was that this Jesus who did that rose from the dead, and he defeated sin and death. And that's Hebrews chapter 2, around about verse 14. So, I hope that this helps you to have a fresh appreciation for the Old Testament and able to have an aha moment as you continue to read through your Bible. With that, I'm going to pray, and then before we go, I want to invite you, if you haven't yet given this a thumbs up, please do. If you're not yet a subscriber, please subscribe. And if you are able to hit that notification bell, I know I've been a little bit irregular. My health is a real battle at the moment, but I'm trying to get these out. But let me pray for you. Father, I thank you for those who've joined with me now. I pray, Lord, that as we together look at this message to the Hebrews, that, Father, you would help people to have an aha moment, and that, Lord, they would get it. I pray, Lord, for those who have, up until this point, struggled with the Old Testament, that, Lord, they'd begin to see that the law points to Jesus, the stories point to Jesus, and the prophets point to Jesus. And may this help people to see you, God, as the God of love, care, grace, and mercy that is available, Lord, right now for everyone watching and listening to this now. In Jesus' name, amen. Bless you, and we'll see you in our next installment in the message to the Hebrews.